I'm Karim Harji from the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, and it is my pleasure to provide some introductory remarks to this panel on standards and frameworks for IMM. I'm going to talk about how I see IMM, introduce you to some of the concepts and questions that the field is working through, situate some of the standards and frameworks and how they've evolved, and present the opportunity for IMM looking forward. According to the common definition from the GIN and the IMP, IMM includes both identifying and considering the positive and negative effects of one's business or investments on people and planet. And what we're trying to do is mitigate any of the negative effects and maximize the positive effects in alignment with the goals and capital that we are deploying. I'll talk a bit more about some of the trends, but what we're seeing is greater demand for clarity of impact goals as well as data. Many more approaches and tools and frameworks, and there's increasing interoperability between them. Unsurprising, there are different stakeholders with multiple objectives and different use cases for IMM. One of the things that distinguishes IMM is the concept of impact management. It's not just about looking back at what happened around what impact you had, but also to look ahead at how to make decisions to maximize your impact in the future, given your context, capabilities, and resources. Now, if we think about the concept of impact measurement more broadly, I'd encourage us to think about this in a few ways. The first is framing impact measurement as a toolkit rather than a singular standard or approach or framework. We're thinking about developing a toolkit that includes principles, approaches, standards, processes, all of which allow us to make better judgments of what a project or investment or portfolio has achieved in terms of social or environmental changes. Both the research and practice are still in the early days of professionalizing this field, but we've seen a lot of progress in the last decade. However, there are few conventions on how to handle this plurality of stakeholders and recognize that there's still a bit of ambiguity in the way that we define concepts, tools, and frameworks, but also increasingly greater shared language, adoption of key standards, and norms and practices. The key point, though, is when we think about what impact measurement and management looks like, it's a dynamic activity. We're looking back, but we're also looking ahead, and we also want to look beyond the things that we typically would be looking at when we count things. So some of the impacts we might look at are quite tangible and obvious and reportable. In other cases, we have to go beyond that to think about the strategic implications in ways we add new value as a result of the insights we're getting from IMM. We can think about this in terms of three different aspects or principles of IMM. The first is that impact investors need to articulate their intentions. You have to be clear about why you're measuring and who is measuring. You also want to be able to integrate those considerations around impact at each stage of how you make investment decisions. We want to be able to value this and integrate it at all parts of our process to ensure that it gets the attention it deserves. And increasingly, we're asking questions around integrity. Are we really doing what we say? Is the data that we use to support the claims we make valid, reliable, and verifiable? These three principles are particularly important because impact investors are often clear about their intentions. They're getting better at integrating impact considerations at all stages of the investment process. Now they're being held to account around impact integrity to ensure that the claims that they're making are backed up by the right kinds of evidence, data, and transparency. Over the last decade, we've seen a lot of movement and shifts in IMM. And the GIN has recently put out a summary of some of these trends that are presented here. The first is that we can see that investors tend to rely on the scale of the problem and the broad issue areas when defining impact priorities, while investee objectives and data play a greater role when investors set specific targets. Now, we see this when impact investors have broad theories of change that are often related to sectors or thematic issues. However, when it comes down to transaction level, we're often quite specific around what we expect in terms of data, reporting, and disclosure. On the standards front, we've seen a lot more shift towards using common frameworks and standards. These include the Sustainable Development Goals for overall strategy and direction, IRIS Plus metrics and indicators for specific measurement and management objectives, and IMP as the language being adopted around IMM. We also see that IMM is being increasingly valued by investors, both in terms of the attention and the skills that are being directed towards it. We know that investors are beginning to use impact data that they're collecting, but there's still some questions around how to move from measurement to management and tensions between financial considerations and impact considerations. One of the notable gaps, according to this research, is that impact investors don't typically engage with end stakeholders, but may have conversations with investees on a variety of different things, including impact performance. And we're beginning to see some shifts towards using verification around impact practice, much less so around performance. The overall picture is one of increasing evolution, sophistication, and activity around IMM. There's been a lot of progress around standards, tools, and frameworks, much more activity, adoption, and integration. And now the big questions are around impact integrity, participation, and the use of IMM findings for decision-making and both strategy and governance. There are a number of different starting points that investors typically use. Talked about the SDGs, the IMP norms, but also others like the operating principles for impact management, UNPRI, and the SDG impact standards. On the tools and systems side, we see IRIS being used quite a bit, as well as other efforts, SASB and GRI, and a number of sector-specific or segment-specific platforms and tools. The good news is that regardless of where you are in your journey around IMM, one of these areas is an obvious starting point. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and there are a lot more examples now than we had even 5 years ago. Increasingly, the guidance around what to pick, what is appropriate when, and how to use them is becoming available as well. This is an example from the Impact Management Platform, which has a great systems map for both organizations as well as for investors. Encourage you to check those out because it provides some good wayfinding among the range of different frameworks, tools, and approaches. So in my final remarks, I want to summarize the opportunity more broadly around IMM. I would say if you're not already doing this, you're behind. Increasing mainstream attention, regulators are going to be asking questions, both in capital market as well as around social impact. And so you should be paying attention and already beginning to use these tools and frameworks. You should also encourage engagement across your organizations with many of these initiatives and approaches. It shouldn't be just one person's job or even one team's job. Staff across all types of organizations are increasingly interested in issues of impact, purpose, and mission. They should be encouraged to get to know many of these platforms, tools, and frameworks, including the ones that will be presented, and to also think about the ways in which they can be applied in unique and creative ways to the work that you do. And my two final remarks are around reframing what IMM is. Sometimes we conflate IMM with reporting, and I think it's important to go beyond reporting to think about how we can uncover new value and opportunities from doing this well. In this way, IMM is strategic. And the other myth or challenge is this notion that IMM is difficult. I don't think it's difficult. I think change management is difficult. And we know that IMM has behavioral and relational components to it. And so when we think about what the opportunity for IMM is, there are a lot of starting points. Easy to get started. There's a community behind you. There are a lot of options. You should go beyond the reporting agenda and think about the strategic implications. But equally, you should consider this as a change management exercise where you have the opportunity to uncover new value, new insights, and to get even better around how you link all parts of your organization in service of greater impact for people and planet. Thank you.